The last time your dog licked you, you probably got it completely wrong. Ethan barely looked up from his phone as Rocky padded across the living room floor, nails clicking softly against the hardwood, tail low but hopeful, and without hesitation the dog pressed close and began licking the back of his hand, slow at first, then a little faster, like he was trying to say something before Ethan lost interest again. And that's exactly what happened, because within seconds Ethan pulled his hand away with a quiet sigh, wiping it against his jeans like it was nothing more than a minor annoyance. "Dude, stop," he muttered, not even making eye contact, not even noticing the way Rocky paused for half a second, tongue still, eyes searching his face for a reaction that never came, because to Ethan it was just a habit, something dogs do, like barking at the mailman or chasing shadows across the wall, meaningless, automatic, easy to ignore, and if you asked him right then why Rocky did it, he would have shrugged and said something simple, something surface level, maybe that the dog wanted food, or attention, or was just being weird again, because that's what most people believe, that licking is random, or needy, or just a leftover instinct that doesn't really matter anymore. But here's the part almost no one realizes, the part that changes everything once you see it. Your dog doesn't do anything for no reason, not something this consistent, not something this targeted, not something that always seems to happen when you're distracted, or stressed, or about to walk away, because in that moment, while Ethan was already scrolling again, already mentally somewhere else, Rocky was still there, still close, still watching, as if waiting for something more than just being tolerated, something most owners miss completely. And the uncomfortable truth is this: what looks small to you, what feels like nothing, what you brush off without thinking, might actually be one of the clearest messages your dog has been trying to send you every single day. And if you've ever pushed it away, ignored it, or misunderstood it, you're not alone, because almost everyone does, until one day, something shifts, and you realize it was never just a lick, it was something far more important than that. HA with grave NH 6 6. The shift did not happen all at once, it never does, it happened in small moments that were easy to overlook if you were not paying attention, and Ethan was not yet, because from his perspective nothing had really changed. Rocky was still there, still following him from room to room, still lying near his feet when he worked, still watching him with that same quiet focus. But something subtle had started to fade, something that used to happen without hesitation now came with a pause, and that pause grew just a little longer each day, because where Rocky once moved in immediately, closing the distance without thinking, now he stopped just short, watching first, waiting, as if checking whether this was still a welcome space or not, and most of the time, Ethan did not notice that hesitation at all. He only noticed when it disappeared completely, because there came a night, late, the kind of night where everything felt a little heavier than usual, when Ethan sat on the couch staring at nothing in particular, phone in his hand but not really using it, the room quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, and out of habit, out of a pattern that had been built over months, Rocky got up and walked toward him, slow, careful, reading him the way dogs always do, and for a second it looked like the old rhythm would repeat itself, that familiar moment where contact would be made, where something unspoken would pass between them, but it did not happen, because Rocky stopped, just inches away, and instead of reaching out, he stayed there, looking up at Ethan with a stillness that felt different, not anxious, not demanding, just waiting, and then after a few seconds, he turned and lay down on the floor instead, quiet, contained, as if something had been held back, and that was the moment Ethan actually noticed, not the 100 times before when Rocky had tried, but the one time he did not, because absence has a way of revealing what presence could not, and even though Ethan could not explain it, there was a small, uncomfortable feeling that settled in, something that did not quite make sense yet but refused to go away, because the behavior he had dismissed as nothing had just stopped, and without it, the space between them felt different, a little colder, a little more distant, like a connection that had always been there without effort was no longer reaching him the same way, and for the first time, whether he realized it or not, Ethan was beginning to feel the effect of something he never understood in the first place. That night should have passed like any other, just another quiet evening in the same apartment, the same routine, the same distance that had slowly built without Ethan ever naming it, but something about it lingered, something subtle but persistent, because once you notice an absence like that, it is hard to unsee it, and even though Ethan tried to brush it off at first, telling himself it did not matter, that Rocky was just tired or distracted or finally calming down, the pattern did not correct itself the next day, or the day after that, and that was where the uneasiness began to grow, not in a sudden realization, but in a slow accumulation of small, almost invisible changes, because Rocky was still there, still close, still watching, but the way he interacted had shifted, the timing was different, the certainty was gone, and most importantly, the initiative had faded. Where he once reached out first, now he waited. Where he once closed the gap, now he held back, and that restraint carried a weight Ethan could feel even if he could not explain it, because connection, when it is consistent, becomes something you stop noticing, but when it weakens, even slightly, it leaves a space behind, and that space does not stay empty, it fills with questions, with doubt, with the uncomfortable sense that something meaningful is being lost without you fully understanding how or why, and for Ethan, that question finally surfaced in a quiet moment a few evenings later, when he sat down again after a long day, almost expecting that familiar interruption, that small, persistent gesture he used to push away without thinking, and when it did not come, when the moment passed without it, he found himself looking over instead, actually looking this time, noticing Rocky lying a few feet away, alert but still, eyes on him but body unmoving, as if waiting for a signal that had not been given in a long time, and something about that image did not sit right, because it did not match the dog he thought he knew, the one who used to cross the room without hesitation, the one who used to reach out no matter how many times he was dismissed. And for the first time, Ethan did not interpret that absence as peace or quiet, he felt it as distance, and that shift, that small internal recognition, was where everything began to change, because the moment you start questioning a behavior you once ignored, you are no longer in control of the narrative you told yourself about it, you are opening the door to the possibility that you were wrong, and that something you thought meant nothing may have meant far more than you ever allowed yourself to see. The answer did not come all at once, it rarely does. It came in fragments, in things Ethan had heard before but never really listened to, in passing comments from other dog owners, in short videos he would normally scroll past, in small pieces of information that only started to connect because now there was a question sitting underneath them, and once that question existed, everything began to look different, because what he had always dismissed as random suddenly had a pattern, and that pattern pointed to something he had completely misunderstood, because licking was never just one thing, it was layered, it carried different meanings depending on the moment, the energy, the context, and that was the part that hit him the hardest, because he realized it had not been happening randomly at all, it had been happening precisely when Rocky felt something shift in him, when his stress rose, when his attention disappeared, when his presence became distant even if his body was still in the room. And what shocked Ethan was not just that dogs could notice that, but that they would respond to it, not by pulling away, not by ignoring it, but by moving closer, by trying to reconnect in the only way they knew how, because for a dog, physical contact is not just affection, it is regulation, it is grounding, it is a way to stabilize both themselves and the person they are bonded to, and licking, as simple as it looks, is one of the most direct forms of that contact, especially when it is gentle, repeated, and focused. Because it carries scent, it carries familiarity, it carries a signal that says you are still here, we are still connected, everything is okay. And when Ethan thought back to those moments, really thought about them for the first time, the timing became impossible to ignore. It was always when he was overwhelmed, always when he was distracted, always when he was about to get up and leave without acknowledging Rocky at all, and the realization that followed was uncomfortable in a way he did not expect, because it meant that what he had been pushing away was not neediness or annoyance, it was an attempt to reconnect, an attempt to close a gap that he himself had been creating without realizing it, and that changed the meaning of every small interaction he could remember, every time he pulled his hand away, every time he sighed, every time he told Rocky to stop without even looking at him, because from Rocky's perspective, those were not neutral responses, they were signals too, signals that said the connection was not being returned, that the effort was not welcome, and dogs learn from patterns like that, not with logic, but with experience, adjusting their behavior over time based on what gets reinforced and what gets shut down, which meant that the hesitation Ethan had started to notice was not random either, it was learned, it was the result of dozens of small moments adding up, and the hardest part to accept was this: Rocky had not changed on his own, he had changed in response to Ethan, and once that realization settled in, it became impossible to go back to thinking that any of it was meaningless anymore. The moment that changed everything was not dramatic, it did not come with a loud realization or a sudden emotional reaction, it came quietly, in the same living room, under the same dim light, with the same routine that had been repeating for weeks, but this time Ethan did something different, not because he was sure of what to do, but because he could not ignore what he had started to understand. So when Rocky stood a few feet away, watching, waiting in that now familiar stillness, Ethan did not look back at his phone, he did not sigh or shift away, he stayed present, really present, and slowly, almost awkwardly, he lowered his hand toward the space between them, not forcing anything, not calling Rocky over, just offering something that had been missing before, and for a second nothing happened. Rocky did not rush forward the way he used to, he did not immediately close the gap, he stayed exactly where he was, reading the situation with that quiet precision dogs have, as if trying to decide whether this was real or just another moment that would disappear, and that hesitation carried weight, because it showed exactly how much had changed. But then, after a few seconds that felt longer than they were, Rocky took a step closer, then another, slow, cautious, his body relaxed but not fully committed yet, until he reached Ethan's hand and paused again, and this time, instead of pulling away, Ethan held still, letting the moment happen without interrupting it, and when Rocky finally leaned in and began to lick his hand again, it was different, not just because of the action itself, but because of how it was received, because for the first time Ethan did not interpret it as something to stop. He saw it for what it was, a quiet attempt to reconnect, to re-establish something that had been weakened over time, and instead of breaking that moment, he responded, not in a dramatic way, not with exaggerated affection, but with something simple and steady, a soft voice, a gentle touch, a presence that stayed instead of pulling away, and that small shift created something immediate, something you could feel even without understanding it in technical terms, because Rocky's body relaxed. His movements became more fluid, his hesitation eased just enough to show that the message had been received, and that was the turning point, not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because the direction had changed, because for the first time, the communication was no longer one-sided, it was being met, acknowledged, returned, and in that exchange, Ethan realized something that went beyond just this one behavior, something that reframed everything he thought he knew about his dog, that these small actions, the ones that are easiest to ignore, are often the most important ones, because they are the purest form of communication a dog has, and when you miss them, you are not just missing information, you are missing connection, and when you finally see them clearly, you cannot unsee what they were trying to give you all along. What surprised Ethan the most was not that Rocky responded, but how quickly the change showed itself once the signal was finally understood, because over the next few days something subtle but undeniable began to rebuild between them, not in big, obvious gestures, but in the same small moments that had once been ignored, only now they carried meaning, now they were noticed, and that changed everything. Because Rocky did not suddenly become more affectionate, he became more certain again. The hesitation that had crept into his movement started to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that his approach would not be rejected the way it had been before, and it showed in the details, in the way he closed the distance without pausing as long, in the way his body relaxed sooner, in the way his eyes softened the moment Ethan stayed present instead of pulling away, and Ethan began to see patterns he had never recognized before. Because licking was not the same every time, sometimes it was slow and calm, almost like a steady rhythm, happening when the room was quiet and his mind was busy. Other times it was quicker, more frequent, paired with small shifts in Rocky's posture, happening when something in the environment felt off or unfamiliar, and once you see those differences, you cannot go back to thinking it is all the same, because each variation carries a different layer of meaning, and that realization changed how Ethan responded. Not by overreacting, not by turning every moment into something intense, but by matching the energy in a way that made sense, staying calm when Rocky was calm, offering reassurance when Rocky seemed uncertain, allowing the contact instead of interrupting it, and what he noticed was something most people never take the time to observe, that when the response is right, the behavior resolves itself naturally. Rocky did not need to keep licking endlessly, he did not escalate or become demanding, he settled, faster than before, as if the message had been delivered and received without resistance. And that is the part that shifts the entire perspective, because what looks like neediness from the outside is often just incomplete communication, and when that communication is finally completed, the behavior finds its own balance, and for Ethan, that meant something deeper than just understanding one action. It meant realizing that every interaction carries weight, that every small response teaches something, either reinforcing the connection or weakening it, and once you become aware of that, you start to notice how often dogs are adjusting themselves to us, adapting in ways we rarely acknowledge, because they are always trying to meet us where we are, even when we are not paying attention, even when we are distracted, even when we misunderstand them. And that awareness does not make the relationship complicated, it makes it clearer, because suddenly those small, everyday moments are no longer random, they are part of a continuous conversation that has been happening the entire time, whether you were listening or not. By the end of that week, nothing in Ethan's apartment looked different, nothing had been rearranged, nothing had been replaced, but the space itself felt changed in a way that was hard to describe unless you had experienced it, because the difference was not in what you could see, it was in what was happening underneath every small interaction, in the way attention was given instead of withheld, in the way presence replaced distraction, in the way a simple moment was no longer dismissed as nothing. And what made it even more striking was how little it actually required, because Ethan had not learned a complicated system, he had not memorized rules or techniques, he had only started to notice, to pause, to respond instead of react, and that was enough to shift the entire dynamic, because Rocky had never needed perfection, he had only needed recognition, and once that was there, everything else followed naturally, the connection felt steadier, the distance that had quietly grown began to close, and those small gestures that once felt like interruptions now felt like invitations, invitations to engage, to reconnect, to be part of something that had always been there but had gone partially unseen, and the truth Ethan came to understand was not just about one behavior, it was about a pattern that exists in almost every relationship between humans and dogs, where the most meaningful signals are often the easiest to overlook, because they are quiet, repetitive, and woven into everyday life in a way that makes them seem insignificant, but they are not insignificant, they are foundational, they are how dogs maintain the bond they depend on, how they check in, how they reassure themselves that the connection is still intact, and when those signals are missed repeatedly, the bond does not disappear, but it does adjust, it becomes more cautious, more reserved, shaped by the responses it receives over time, and that is the part most people never realize, that their reactions are teaching something constantly, even in the smallest moments, even in the ones that feel too minor to matter, and once you see that clearly, it changes how you move through those moments, because you begin to understand that when your dog reaches out, in whatever way they know how, they are not just acting, they are communicating, and whether that communication grows stronger or fades depends largely on how it is met, and the final piece of this is something simple but difficult to ignore once you feel it, that dogs do not need us to be perfect, they do not need us to understand everything immediately, but they do need us to be present enough to notice when they are trying, because unlike us, they do not overthink their connection, they do not hold back out of pride or hesitation, they offer it freely,